In the frozen wasteland of Lake Peipus, two worlds collided on a sheet of ice that would crack under the weight of history itself. Picture this: an army of warrior monks in white cloaks bearing black crosses, their horses breathing steam in the bitter cold, facing down a young Russian prince who had already earned his spurs in blood. This wasn't just another medieval skirmish. This was the moment that would decide whether Orthodox Christianity would survive in the East, or whether the Pope's crusading knights would carve their way to Moscow itself. The year was 1242 and Europe was a powder keg. While most people think the Crusades only happened in the Holy Land, the truth is far more brutal. The Northern Crusades were raging across the Baltic, and German warrior monks were systematically conquering pagan tribes and Orthodox Christians alike. They called it spreading the faith. The Russians called it what it was: invasion. But here's what makes this story incredible. Standing in their way was a 22-year-old prince named Alexander, who would become known to history as Alexander Nevsky. And on April 5th, 1242, he would orchestrate one of the most brilliant military victories in medieval history. A battle so decisive that it would echo through the centuries and inspire a nation to resist foreign domination for generations to come. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If Alexander lost, the last independent Orthodox stronghold in northern Russia would fall. The Teutonic Knights would have a clear path to Novgorod, and from there nothing could stop their march toward the heart of Russian lands. This was the end of the line, the final stand, the moment when everything hung in the balance. Let me tell you about the forces that converged on that frozen lake, because understanding who these warriors were will help you grasp just how impossible Alexander's victory really was. The Teutonic Knights weren't your average medieval army. These men were the elite special forces of their era, warrior monks who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but who had also dedicated their lives to warfare in the name of Christ. Founded during the Third Crusade in 1190, they had spent decades perfecting the art of conquest across the Baltic region. Picture them in your mind. Heavily armored men on massive destrier war horses, both knight and mount encased in steel. Their great helms covered their faces completely, turning them into faceless instruments of war. Even their horses wore armor, with chanfrons protecting their faces and trappers bearing the distinctive white and black colors of the order. These weren't just soldiers. They were a military machine that had conquered most of the Baltic coast. Their battle doctrine was simple and terrifying. Who fights the order fights Jesus Christ. Their war cry echoed across a dozen battlefields. Gott mit uns. God is with us. They slept with their swords, practiced self-flagellation, and many wore mail directly against their flesh to mortify it. These men had turned suffering into strength, discipline into devastation. The Teutonic Knights had perfected the shock charge, the devastating cavalry tactic that could shatter enemy formations in minutes. They would form up in their signature wedge formation, the spearhead of death that had broken army after army across the Baltic. When these knights charged, the earth trembled and most enemies simply broke and ran before the impact. But the situation facing the Russian lands in 1242 was even more desperate than just dealing with the Teutonic threat. The Orthodox principalities were caught in a nightmare scenario that would have broken lesser men. From the east, the Mongol hordes had already devastated most of Russia. Kiev had fallen. Moscow was paying tribute. The Golden Horde controlled vast swathes of Russian territory, and their armies could appear without warning to burn entire cities to ash. From the west came the Catholic Crusaders, not just the Teutonic Knights, but Swedes, Danes, and the Livonian Order, all convinced that God wanted them to subjugate the Orthodox heretics. The Pope had declared that converting or conquering the Eastern Orthodox was just as holy as fighting Muslims in Jerusalem. This was Alexander Nevsky's impossible situation. Fight the Germans and the Mongols might decide you're too strong and crush you completely. Submit to the Germans and Orthodox Christianity dies in northern Russia. Try to fight both and you'll be annihilated by forces that outnumber you 10 to 1. But Alexander was no ordinary prince. Born in 1220, he had already proven his military genius 2 years earlier at the Battle of the Neva, where he had crushed a Swedish invasion force so thoroughly that he earned his nickname, Nevsky. The young prince understood something that most leaders of his era missed. Sometimes survival requires choosing your battles with surgical precision. Alexander made the calculated decision to pay tribute to the Mongols while resisting the Western Crusaders. This wasn't cowardice, it was strategic brilliance. The Mongols, for all their brutality, generally allowed conquered peoples to keep their religion and customs as long as they paid taxes and provided soldiers. The Catholic Crusaders offered no such luxury. Their goal was total conversion or total destruction. When the Livonian Order, an offshoot of the Teutonic Knights, captured the fortress cities of Izborsk and Pskov in 1240 and 1241, the people of Novgorod knew they had to act. These weren't just military defeats, they were existential threats. The Crusaders weren't interested in tribute or negotiation. They wanted to erase Orthodox Christianity from the map. The citizens of Novgorod had actually banished Alexander earlier due to internal political disputes, but when faced with annihilation, they swallowed their pride and begged him to return. The young prince answered the call, and what followed was a campaign that would become the stuff of legend. Alexander moved with the speed and precision of a master tactician. In 1241, he retook both Votia and Pskov, driving the Crusaders back and freeing the captured Russian territories. But he knew this was just the beginning. The Livonian Order and their allies wouldn't accept these defeats. They would return with a larger force, and when they did, Alexander needed to be ready. The Crusader response was exactly what Alexander expected. By early 1242, a coalition army was assembling that represented the flower of Northern European military might. Danish knights, German crusaders, Estonian infantry, and about 100 members of the Livonian Order itself. Conservative estimates put their force at around 2,600 men, including 800 Danish and German knights, 100 Teutonic Knights, 300 Danes, 400 Germans, and 1,000 Estonian infantry. Against this professional army, Alexander could field about 5,000 men. But the composition tells the real story of the odds he faced. His core force consisted of his personal bodyguard, the Druzhina, maybe 1,000 elite warriors who had fought beside him for years. Beyond that, he had 2,000 militia from Novgorod, brave men but not professional soldiers, 1,400 Finno-Ugrian tribesmen whose loyalty was uncertain, and 600 horse archers. On paper, the numbers looked reasonable, but anyone who understood medieval warfare knew the truth. Those 900 heavy cavalry knights on the Crusader side weren't just soldiers. They were medieval tanks. A single knight in full armor on a trained warhorse was worth 10 ordinary infantry in open battle. The mathematics of medieval combat heavily favored the Crusaders. But Alexander Nevsky had spent years studying his enemies, and he had identified their greatest weakness. The Teutonic Knights and their allies were supremely confident, perhaps overconfident. They had conquered so many enemies with their signature wedge charge that they had begun to believe they were invincible. That arrogance would become their downfall. As winter gripped the land and Lake Peipus froze solid, Alexander began implementing a plan that would either save Orthodox Russia or destroy it completely. Alexander knew that defeating the Crusaders required more than courage. It demanded perfect timing, flawless execution, and a willingness to risk everything on a single moment of tactical brilliance. The young prince understood that his enemy's greatest strength, their devastating heavy cavalry charge, could become their greatest weakness if he could manipulate the battlefield to his advantage. The location Alexander chose for his stand would become legendary. Lake Peipus stretched across the border between Russian and Estonian lands, a vast sheet of ice thick enough to support armies but treacherous enough to become a death trap for the unwary. Near a landmark known as Crow Stone, Alexander positioned his forces and waited for the Crusaders to take the bait. But this wasn't a desperate last stand. This was a masterpiece of medieval military engineering, planned with the precision of a chess grandmaster moving pieces across a board where every mistake meant death. Alexander deliberately retreated onto the frozen lake, drawing the overconfident Crusaders away from solid ground and onto terrain where their heavy armor and massive war horses would become liabilities instead of advantages. The ice was thick, but ice has limits, and Alexander knew exactly what those limits were. The Russian battle formation broke every conventional rule of medieval warfare. Traditionally, armies placed their strongest forces in the center, creating a solid line that could absorb and repel enemy charges. Alexander did the opposite. He weakened his center deliberately, placing his main strength on the flanks where the Crusaders wouldn't expect it. In front of his army, Alexander positioned an advanced detachment of light cavalry, archers, and slingers. These weren't meant to stop the Crusader charge, they were meant to slow it down, to disrupt the perfect formation that made the Teutonic wedge so devastating. Behind his left flank, hidden from enemy view, Alexander concealed his elite Druzhina cavalry, his personal guard who had followed him through every campaign. The rear of the Russian formation faced the precipitous eastern shore of the lake. To any observer, this looked like a tactical blunder, cutting off their own escape route. In reality, it was psychological warfare. Alexander's men knew they had nowhere to run. They would fight with the desperation of cornered wolves, while the Crusaders would fight with the overconfidence of predators who thought they had trapped easy prey. Dawn broke on April 5th, 1242, and the two armies faced each other across the frozen expanse. The morning air was so cold it burned the lungs, and every breath created clouds of steam that hung in the still air like battle smoke before the fighting even began. The Crusaders formed their traditional wedge, the iron spearhead that had shattered armies from Lithuania to Estonia. At the tip rode the most experienced knights, veterans whose lances had pierced a dozen enemy formations. Behind them came rank after rank of armored warriors, their horses snorting and pawing the ice, eager for the charge that would decide the fate of northern Russia. The sight must have been terrifying. Hundreds of armored figures on massive war horses, their weapons gleaming in the morning light, their banners snapping in the bitter wind. The sound of their approach would have been like thunder rolling across the frozen lake. The crash of metal, the thunder of hooves on ice, the battle cries of men who believed God himself rode beside them. Alexander stood with his men, rosary in one hand, sword in the other, watching death approach across the ice. But where other commanders might have seen doom, he saw opportunity. Every step the Crusaders took onto the lake brought them deeper into his trap. The charge began with a sound like the world ending. 900 heavy cavalry launched themselves across the ice, their lances leveled, their formation tight as a clenched fist. The earth trembled under thousands of iron-shod hooves, and the ice itself groaned under the weight of so much metal and horseflesh moving at full speed. Alexander's light cavalry and archers met them first, loosing volley after volley of arrows into the charging mass. Most arrows bounced harmlessly off the Crusaders' armor, but some found gaps and horses began to stumble. The perfect wedge formation started to waver as wounded mounts disrupted the charge. But the Crusaders pressed on, their momentum carrying them through the first line of Russian defenders. The Novgorodian militia in the center absorbed the main impact of the charge, and for a moment it looked like the battle would follow the familiar pattern. The unstoppable force meeting the immovable object, with the force winning as it always did. The Crusaders carved through the Russian center like a sword through silk, their lances finding targets, their war horses trampling fallen defenders. Victory seemed within their grasp. They had broken the enemy line, scattered the militia, and now all that remained was the pursuit and slaughter that would end Orthodox resistance in northern Russia forever. But Alexander had planned for this moment. As the Crusaders drove deep into his center, they found themselves funneled into an increasingly narrow space, pressed against the precipitous eastern shore of the lake where they could not deploy their superior numbers effectively. Their formation, so perfect for the initial charge, became a liability as they crowded together in the confined space. That was when Alexander sprang his trap. From both flanks, Russian forces that the Crusaders had barely noticed suddenly crashed into the sides of the wedge formation. These weren't militia or light cavalry. These were Alexander's best warriors, men who had trained for years for exactly this moment. The psychological impact was devastating. The Crusaders had thought they were pursuing broken enemies, only to discover they were surrounded by fresh troops attacking from unexpected directions. The battle transformed in an instant from a Crusader victory charge into a desperate melee where superior armor and training meant less than position and numbers. The ice became slick with blood as men fought with sword and axe, mace and dagger, and the closest, most brutal combat medieval warfare could offer. But the masterstroke was yet to come. As the flanking attacks disrupted the Crusader formation, Alexander unleashed his druzhina from their concealment behind the left flank. His elite cavalry struck the rear of the Crusader force like a hammer blow, completing the encirclement and turning what had been a confident advance into a nightmare of confusion and terror. The Crusaders found themselves trapped in a killing box of Alexander's design, pressed between the lake shore and attacking enemies on three sides, their formation shattered, their advantage in heavy cavalry neutralized by the confined terrain and the chaos of close combat. The battle that had begun at dawn raged until late in the night. But the outcome was decided in those crucial minutes when Alexander's trap closed around the cream of Northern European knighthood. When the Crusaders finally broke and ran, they fled not as conquering heroes but as beaten men. Their dreams of crushing Orthodox Russia shattered on the ice of Lake Peipus. The pursuit was merciless. Russian cavalry chased the fleeing Crusaders across the frozen lake toward what is now Cape Sigovets, cutting down those too slow to escape. The ice ran red with blood, and the lake that was meant to be the Crusaders' highway to victory became their road to defeat. When the smoke cleared and the last echoes of battle faded across Lake Peipus, the impossible had happened. A 22-year-old prince had outmaneuvered and destroyed the finest military force in Northern Europe. 400 Crusaders lay dead on the ice, while only 20 knights survived to tell the tale of their humiliation. The Teutonic war machine that had seemed unstoppable was broken, their dreams of Orthodox conquest shattered like ice under a hammer blow. But this victory meant more than just tactical brilliance. Alexander Nevsky had saved Orthodox Christianity in northern Russia when it hung by a thread. He had proven that faith combined with intelligence could triumph over superior numbers and equipment. The battle became a legend that would inspire Russian resistance for centuries to come. A reminder that even the mightiest enemies could be defeated by those who refused to kneel. The young prince who stood victorious on that frozen battlefield would be canonized as a saint, his name forever linked with the defense of Russian independence. And perhaps that's the real lesson of Lake Peipus. That sometimes history turns on the actions of a single man who understands that some battles cannot be avoided, and some stands must be taken no matter the odds. When everything seems lost, remember Alexander Nevsky standing on the ice, sword in hand, facing down an empire. Because sometimes, just sometimes, David really does defeat Goliath.